Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our third discussion on racism, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. I'm Tish Calamer, Community Engagement Manager at the Gale Borden Public Library District, and it is my pleasure to go over a few little details with you before we get going. If you have any questions, I encourage you, please leave them in the Q&A rather than the chat, because then we'll have a better chance of finding your question. Also, if you would like to join the meeting as a panelist, that doesn't mean you have to have any content prepared. You don't have to do a book report, but it would allow you to be seen and heard. If you think you would like to do that, please leave your name in the chat and I will promote you to panelist status. I would like to also point out that today's program didn't just happen in a vacuum. We had a lot of help from various people in our community, which is wonderful because with this topic, we all have to work together. This program, this entire series has been presented in partnership with CERL, which is the Coalition of Elgin Religious Leaders, the Elgin Cultural Arts Commission, the Elgin Human Relations Commission, Fox Valley Citizens for Peace and Justice, and the Kane County Sheriff's Office. Now I'd like to introduce to you Denise Tracy, who is the lead chaplain at the Kane County Sheriff's Department on their chaplains team, and she will take it away from here.
I'm so glad that everybody is here. A year ago at the Coalition for Elgin Religious Leaders, we were meeting and we decided that it would be an important service to the community to gather people together to have some community reads on racism. This is the third and final one, and we chose Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me, because raising children in this world and teaching us all how to be better stewards of our children seemed an important part of this. So thank you everyone for coming. I hope you enjoy this. And Joyce, I think I'm supposed to turn it over to you now.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you, Tish, for the opening. Again, like you've heard before, I'm excited that folks are here. We think this is a very important conversation, and we have some people here that we know have lots to add to the conversation. So rather than continue on, I will just say hi, my name is Joyce Fountain, long-term resident here in Elgin. Also with us today is Tracy Ellis, who you will be hearing from. Most of these folks you will be hearing from. In fact, how about this? As I have you begin speaking, I'll start with you, Tracy. Do a 2-second bio and then facilitate your part of introducing us to the book.
Okay, thank you, Joyce. 2-second bio. I'm Traci O'Neal Ellis. I'm the Chief Human Resources, Chief Equity, and Chief Legal Officer at the Illinois Math and Science Academy. And I speak and write widely on race, racism, anti-racism, the intersection of race, law, and politics, etc. Thank you. So you want me to go ahead and start with my opening comments about the book?
Yes, if you would.
Well, it's hard. It was hard for me to think about what to say about this book because it's a powerful book. It's a powerful book with a lot of powerful messaging. And I love that he chose to write it in a letter to his son, Samori, because it takes away there's no scholarship, and it's not a book written on data and charts and numbers and facts. And it is just a Black father pouring out his heart and concerns and worry for his Black son in this country. So I think there were a lot of powerful messages. But if I had to try to sum it up, which I do briefly, I guess I'd say that Ta-Nehisi Coates refers to the dream a lot in this book, which for me, and I think is a reference to the American dream, coupled with collectively white people's belief in American exceptionalism and that America was built into some great and noble country due to the industrialism, grit, and hard work that they poured into this country. And he contrasts that with the experience of Black people who we have a totally different experience with America. And Coates talks about how America doesn't acknowledge that it was built off the torture and enslavement of Black people and the violence and dehumanization of Black people, and that has persisted through Jim Crow, always underpinned by the lack of safety up into current times, the lack of safety of Black people in our bodies due to police brutality and white supremacy. And the book was written in 2015, and it is both historically accurate for me and it was prophetic. It is prophetic as well. And I think the upshot is exactly what I said in 2017, that the ideals of the American flag don't extend to Black people. And it is that gap between America's belief in American exceptionalism and Black folks' reality of American brutalism. It's that gap that Coates refers to as the conflict that he's wrestling with and for which he doesn't have an answer or can't really provide hope. And when his son realized that there were going to be no indictments, when Samori realized there were going to be no indictments from the Michael Brown killing, how he went in his room and cried, and Coates went in the room after him, but he didn't hug him, he didn't console him, he didn't think that he could leave him with everything's going to be all right, because all evidence to the contrary, well, there's all this evidence to the contrary, that everything is not going to be all right. And that his goal in this book is to try and help his son learn to live in the life that he has as growing into a Black person, specifically a Black man in America. This is your body, this is your world, this is the life. We've got to wrestle and grapple with that. And so we're still in this conflict where we've been for centuries, and still Black people live in that gap between American exceptionalism and American brutalism, the disconnect there. And the fact that America won't acknowledge the generational impact of slavery and convict leasing and Jim Crow Jr. and his wife Sally, and police brutality and redlining and housing discrimination and healthcare discrimination and education discrimination and employment discrimination and the injustices inherent in the American justice system and the prison industrial complex, and on and on and on. The gap is there, the conflict remains, and Black folks live in that gap. And so I think that's what we're here to talk about. I'm happy to be here and have this, necessary, if not sobering, conversation. Thank you.
If I may insert a comment that we got in the Q&A from Margaret Frisch Klein. Hi, Tracy. I thought maybe the dream was MLK as opposed to Malcolm X because it was capitalized. Do you have any comment?
I don't think it's that granular. For me, the dream is this idea, this American dream, that, you work hard and you buy the house with the white picket fence and you raise your children and you go on family vacations and you live this wonderful life because of hard work and life is good and all of that. And that's the dream that I believe he was speaking of. It's not King or Malcolm X. It is the American dream. It is this story that is sold to us. And the reason for which immigrants come here is for a chance at the American dream, right? It's what America is known for. And, but I think we have to really interrogate, and I think what Coates did in this book is interrogate the reality of that dream, and how does that apply, and how is that dream available for Black folks who live a very different reality in this country that as of today is yet unacknowledged.
Thank you, Tracy. Certainly you've given us lots to think about, and you've given us a nice preview and overview of the book. At this time, I'd like to introduce Teresa Lance, who is relatively new to this community. And so she's going to have an opportunity to introduce herself. And then we are going to show a quick film, and then Teresa will help us dive through that piece.
Thank you, Joyce. So good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. As Joyce said, I'm new to the community. So 11 communities feed into School District U46. So I'm an assistant superintendent of equity and innovation here in U46 and started July 1st. I've had the pleasure of meeting Tracy right before I joined U46. So everything that Tracy was saying absolutely resonates with me. I actually have her book and read it, The Exceptional Negro, Racism, White Privilege, and the Lie of Respectability Politics. So I don't want to talk about her work. I think it'll just surface through our dialogue, because really it's unpacking a little bit of Ta-Nehisi Coates' book. But really, I think it's also important that we try to clear the air to allow space for our Black men to talk about the injustices that they've experienced. And it doesn't mean that we negate or neglect that Black women have been brutalized through this system throughout history, throughout enslavement and beyond. And we can talk about Breonna Taylor, we could talk about Atiana Jefferson, so many folks who have been brutalized by this system. And I think what Ta-Nehisi Coates did was he illuminated it even further for us. So again, I think it's sobering conversation, but it's also an important conversation for us to have. And how timely, unfortunate, but timely, because it's on the heels of two, well, we could say three murders. So George Floyd, Dante Wright, and then the young man here in Chicago. But we've got so many, Daniel Prude, Botham Jean. So again, we can all list names. We can talk about Emmett Till, but we'll just get into the video and we'll start to unpack Ta-Nehisi Coates' book. So thank you, Joyce.
Ta-Nehisi Coates. He grew up in Baltimore, and in Between the World and Me, he writes, quote, "To be Black in Baltimore of my youth was to be naked before the elements of the world, before all the guns, fists, knives, crack, rape, and disease. The nakedness is not an error, nor pathology. The nakedness is the correct and intended result of policy, the predictable upshot of people forced for centuries to live under fear." Ta-Nehisi Coates is a national correspondent at the Atlantic, where he writes about culture, politics, and social issues. He received the George Polk Award for his Atlantic cover story, The Case for Reparations, which he joined us to discuss last May. His book, Between the World and Me, is called Required Reading by Toni Morrison, who writes, quote, "I've been wondering who might fill the intellectual void that plagued me after James Baldwin died. Clearly, it is Ta-Nehisi Coates." Well, Ta-Nehisi Coates, welcome back to Democracy Now! And congratulations on your book, Between the World and Me.
Thank you.
You write it as a letter to your son, Samari. Tell us why.
Well, I hate to disappoint you guys, but mostly as a literary technique. I began Between the World and Me after I finished the draft of The Case for Reparations, and I was actually somewhat frustrated with that piece, because it's a very, very empirical piece, very, very much based in the tools of journalism, reportage, very, very evidence-based. But I thought at the same time it made what it meant to live under a system that made reparations essential in the first place abstract. There was a distancing effect about talking about people as numbers, about talking about people, across history. And what I wanted to do with this book is to give the reader some sense of what it meant to live under a system of plunder as an individual, to express that, to take it out of the realm of numbers and to take it directly into, individual people. How does it feel every day in your life to live under such a system? How do you cope with that? How is it warping? How is it perverse? What sort of effects does it ultimately have on you? And how do you, as much as possible, make your peace with it?
And you're right also that the impact of the Ferguson decision, the grand jury's decision not to indict, had on your son, and the not distance it created, but your feeling that you couldn't really explain to him what had happened.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was, I think in a lot of situations like this, there is an immediate urge when our children have a reaction to something that has a racist component to it, to, you know, assure them somehow that everything will be okay, that there's some sort of justice that will win out in the end. And, you know, my study, my, very elementary pedestrian autodidactic study of history does not demonstrate that to be true. My own life does not necessarily demonstrate that to be true. My belief is in the chaos of the world, and that you have to find your peace within the chaos, and that you still have to find some sort of mission. In the book, it's a dedication to the principle of struggle, even within the chaos, with no assurance that you will see any sort of victory within your lifetime.
Here is what I would like for you to know. In America, it's traditional to destroy the Black body, its heritage.
Yeah, that just, as far as I'm concerned, is just a statement of fact, throughout the history. I was sitting here watching the Sandra Bland video, which I have avoided because I think, all of us, have our ways of
Ta-Nehisi Coates is a national correspondent at The Atlantic, where he writes about
not to indict, had on your son, and the not distance it created, but your feeling that you couldn't really explain to him what had happened.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was, I think in a lot of situations like this, there is an immediate urge when our children have a reaction to something that has a racist component to it, to, assure them somehow that everything will be okay, that there's some sort of justice that will win out in the end. And, my study, my, very elementary pedestrian autodidactic study of history does not demonstrate that to be true. My own life does not necessarily demonstrate that to be true. My belief is in the chaos of the world, and that you have to find your peace within the chaos, and that you still have to find some sort of mission. In the book, it's a dedication to the principle of struggle, even within the chaos, with no assurance that you will see any sort of victory within your lifetime.
Here is what I would like for you to know. In America, it's traditional to destroy the Black body, its heritage.
Yeah, that just, as far as I'm concerned, is just a statement of fact, throughout the history. I was sitting here watching the Sandra Bland video, which I have avoided because I think, all of us, have our ways of coping, and sometimes it just becomes a little too much. But I was watching it here, and when you're in a situation where she was stopped for not signaling, I believe it is, when the powers that be, when, the person who is armed with the ability, on behalf of the state to dispense lethal violence, decides to threaten someone with that lethal violence based on a turn signal. That's a statement on where we are. That's a statement on heritage. That's a statement on a whole set of beliefs that undergird that. Very, very disturbing. And unfortunately, those beliefs go back right to the founding of this country.
So you wrote a letter to your son. James Baldwin wrote a letter to his nephew.
Yes.
Toni Morrison said this is required reading and compares you to James Baldwin. The significance of this. You said hers was the only blurb you wanted.
Yeah. Well, in publishing, they do this thing where they just load you down with blurbs, and it's like 10 different people, who they try to find. They, festoon the book, telling. And they managed to do that with Toni Morrison anyway, putting it on both sides. I guess for me, the significance of that quote, that blurb for me, is Toni Morrison is somebody, who has been, such a figure in our community within Black literature for so long. Our greatest living American writer, I think, is a strong argument, for that. I'm partial in some ways to E.L. Doctorow, who just left us last night, as it seems. But Toni Morrison, just, when you think about a figure who just represents what, literature is in this country, and for Black people particularly, there was no one else. And this book is very much, I wrote it to be very much within the tradition of African American literature, with quotes from, Sonia Sanchez, Amiri Baraka, Richard Wright, James Baldwin. That was, how I situated the work. And so I am very, very appreciative, just very, very honored, of our endorsement.
We're going to continue this conversation after break. Toni Morrison writes, the language of Between the World and Me, like Coates' journey, is visceral, eloquent, and beautifully redemptive. And it's an examination of the hazards and hopes of Black male life is as profound as it is revelatory. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with Ta-Nehisi Coates in a minute.
Wow. Watch that video clip just over and over. And so many things that I can pull from that. I'm just going to put a question out to our panelists, but I'd love to get some of our attendees engaged in this conversation as well. So I'm going to pose the question first to allow our attendees to maybe jot down some notes. I'll try not to let the teacher in me come out, but I know I've got some friends on this call. So I might just start with Dr. Aaron Griffin, who is an author, an editor. He is a researcher, a practitioner. So Dr. Aaron Griffin, I'm going to get you in here. Darvell Stinson, I'm going to get you in here. So here's the question. Ta-Nehisi Coates says, there is no assurance of victory, even in your lifetime. There's no assurance of victory. So talking about this lethal violence on the Black body, no assurance of victory, even in your lifetime. What are your thoughts on that? Do you agree? Do you agree with what he said?
I think that I'll chime in. I think that's a really hard question to answer. I would always hope, right, that things will change. But in our lifetime, I sure hope it does. But as I read this book, he was pretty raw, honest, and his writing is beautiful. And I think even in one of the clips, I think the interviewer asked him for solutions or how can we solve this problem? And he basically said he doesn't have any solutions. I think he's just putting the information out there. And I just wanted to also mention how this book made me feel as a mom to 3 sons as I read this book. First of all, it was heartbreaking. And I think, it's hard having the conversation with my children, let alone putting it into writing. And we talk about having to have the talk with our Black sons. And I'm realizing that we're having to have that talk earlier, right? And so just 5 years ago, when my son was 4, my youngest son was 4, and he got a new water gun and he wanted to go out to play with it, right? But for me, and maybe I'm just overprotective, but at that time I said, you cannot go out with the play gun in your hand. And right, because that reminds us of Tamir Rice. And that was a hard conversation for him to have. And then as he got older, this really sat with him. And then he started to ask questions about what happened to George Floyd. And I really did not have all the answers and I did not have solutions. And just last week, as my husband and I were watching some of the highlights from the trial, he came downstairs and he just started to cry. And I had no idea that he was listening to it as he was coming down the stairs, and he started to cry. And so he said, please turn that off. And my husband and I turned it off. And I wanted to console him in that moment. I wanted to offer him hope in that moment. But I know he's 9 years old, and I know that this is the reality. And I don't want to sugarcoat anything. I want him to know that this is a reality that as African-American men and African-Americans that, we face every day. And so what is interesting is the next day we heard his little footsteps and we turned the TV off, and he came and he said, no, I want you to turn it back on. He said, because my friend and I are doing a project about racism. And so that really touched me because it made me realize that even though I could not offer him hope or assurance, but I realized that he is the hope. And I realized that we are the hope. And I know this is a problem. This problem is so huge that even all of us together, we're not able to solve it, right? We need more people. But whether or not this is something that can be solved in our lifetime, I sure hope so. And I do want to be optimistic that the work that we're doing, right, that it's not in vain. But I do know that we need more of us in this fight.
Thank you. I don't know if there are any other panelists that would like to respond to that. Are we able to unmute Dr. Aaron Griffin or Darvell Levias, just any of our folks that are attendees?
I'll jump in because I
Excuse
have.
me, yes. I can unmute anybody who would like to speak.
Okay, so we'll let Tracy respond, and then if we can get Dr. Griffin in this conversation, please.
Okay.
Thank you. Tracy.
Just gonna say, so my sons are adults now. And so I've been through where Toya is and you're, with younger children and how you have the talk with them. And, we were always really concerned about making it age appropriate. And now I have two grandsons that are 3 and 8 and, wrestling with how do you, I was watching something on the news and my 8-year-old grandson came into the room this weekend. And I was like, yeah, no, I don't want you to hear this. And he said, no, it's about George Floyd. I want to hear it. But like, I can barely listen to it. And so I worry about, how does it's that need to sugarcoat and not further harm them. But my own sons now as adults, we have these conversations all the time. And now, with them, they are very, very, they're very raw conversations. And with Ta-Nehisi's work has been described as, so there is no sugarcoating, no careful racial diplomacy, no worry about mediating opinions to cater to what white people might be able to hear. And in the work that I do as chief equity officer and, the speaking and that I do, there's always this tension between me as a Black woman wanting to speak the truth of Black folks' experience, but you always have to be worried about the care and comfort of white people's feelings in these conversations. And so for Coates to just come through with this painfully honest letter was really refreshing, and to paint the picture that we have to remember that it's hard to face, but we use words like, I've heard it described, we use words like race relations and racial justice and racial profiling and white privilege and white supremacy, but that language even can obscure that racism is a really visceral experience. And the way that it was described, I had to write this down, is that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence on Black bodies.
Mm.
And that's the reality. We use a lot of words to obscure that reality and make it more palatable. But those are the conversations that I now can have with my adult sons because they are adults, and we can remove all the sugarcoating from it and get really real about what racism means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
That's really,
great. Give me
you.
one
Can
second.
we
Give me
let,
one second. If we can get Dr. Griffin in here, and then I'll go to Miss Webb. Dr. Webb, sorry. Dr. Griffin, then I'll go to Dr. Webb.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, because I can't see myself. I'm not sure if it was operating. So I read this book. Wow. I read his book, I believe, in 2014. That's when I read it. I was finishing up my dissertation at the time on African American educational lobbyists. What I appreciated about the book is it actually gave me affirmation to a lingering thought that I had. And that was, this will never be over. Not even in my lifetime, beyond that. That this is something that is going to be continuous because there's always a continuous attack. That part about the Black body. And people may see that as physical, like the physical Black body. I don't see it as the physical Black body. I see it as the idea of the Black body that is constantly under attack. That anytime Black people or any other marginalized or minoritized group starts to rise, we see a reaction where laws and statutes and policies are put in place to minimize our advancement. So that 14th Amendment is really the area that I like to do some of my scholarship and some of my study when I try to explain to folks that it's not the 13th Amendment that's the issue. It's not the 15th Amendment. It's the 14th Amendment, that equal protection under law. that we are constantly not seeing. That part that makes us an American ideological body. The 14th Amendment makes us American, not the 13th and not the 15th in my estimation. And that is constantly under attack. So when people say, why can't we all be Americans? I always ask, when at any time in this country's history was I allowed to be American? And then they'll give me examples, and I give them examples of every time individuals like me try to be an American, like, why am I being pulled over? I am met with violence. Why are you following me? I'm met with violence. Every time I elicit one of my rights as an American, I am reminded that I am not, in fact, American. So that 14th Amendment is always there. So when Ta-Nehisi Coates says what he says, that this is ongoing, I'm like, good. I'm not crazy, because I've always felt this is always going to be the fight. I have a 14-year-old and a 10-year-old. And when I was reading his book and I saw that he wrote that letter, I thought to myself, should I do the same for my then, I said this was 2014, for my then 3-year-old? Should I do it? Should I do it for my 7-year-old? Should I do it for my 3-year-old? And I made a conscious decision, no, I'm going to push back against me being forced to have the talk with my children. I'm going to push back. I'm not going to have that talk. I'm going to allow them to have their childhood. And unfortunately, at 7 years old, my second grader did at the time, Dr. Lance, you remember Solomon, the talk happened when he was a second grader, and it happened after Christmas. And he said, Dad, why is it that Santa Claus gave us so many presents and my friends only got one? And why do all the Black people live in Harrison and none of them live by us? That's when it happened. And I had to give him the economic talk. As he got older, what I decided to do was I started introducing him to some of my books from college. He's an advanced reader. So I said, I want you to read this book on African-American history. And that has helped him understand what's happening right now. Because when he saw George Floyd, I didn't even mention it to him. He saw it on YouTube and he came to me and he said, Dad, are we reliving the 60s? And I said, son, it's not that we're reliving the 60s. The issue is we're reliving the same Groundhog Day every 10 years, every year. This is still the same thing that's been going on since before slavery, before slaves came, when indentured servants were here first. It's the same battle with John Punch and everybody. So what you're seeing is the consequence of the United States not addressing the underbelly of our nation and saying, this is not right, this is not correct, forget fair. This is not a human right. We should not have people being treated this way. But as Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing without a fight. So this is a continuum, because there are people who just do not want to concede their power and privilege and the supremacy and the belief that they are intellectually greater than other groups. And as Black people and women and multiple people, and yes, this is somewhat of a stab at white men, as we have proven, white men are not the intellectual superiors of the world. But every time somebody proves that, they attack. There's a law, there's a policy, there's physical harm. That's what this is about.
Yeah.
In this that structure. And I'll pause there.
Yeah, well, Dr. Griffin, thank you for joining in on this conversation. I want to go to Dr. Webb, and then I know we've got some questions in the chat. I'm going to get Dr. Webb in here, but I want to really quickly respond when Tracy was referring to the physical brutality on the body. And then Dr. Griffin, you talked about not just the physical brutality on the body, but we've got this mental and psychological brutality. And so Dr. William Smith out of Utah, he refers to it or coins as this racial battle fatigue. And so everything that we're experiencing, this is truly a racial battle fatigue, whether it's physical or psychological or physiological, we're all experiencing it. Those of us who are in the battle day after day after day. And so I just wanted to try to bring those two thoughts together. Dr. Webb?
Thank you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Toya Webb. I work as the Chief Marketing and Communications Officer at Elgin Community College. Dr. Griffin, thank you so much for your remarks. And I love that you said that you wanted to wade you want your children to have their childhood. And as I think about that, that's so beautiful. And I wish that I had that opportunity. I'm thinking of my two older boys. So my husband was in the military. We lived all over. And once we finally settled, my two older boys faced so many issues with discrimination, unfair treatment in their schools, that my husband and I started to have the talk with them later. And we wish that we had prepared them sooner, because it was just devastating for them. But I want to mention too, and the kids are talking about it in the school. So in 4th grade, 3rd grade, my son was coming home talking about what happened to George Floyd. And so it's like, if we're not having the conversation at our table, it's like they're having it in the schools and on the playground. But what I love about this book, and this leads into the question that you asked earlier about, is there hope? Will we see change in our generation? And I just wanted to read a quote from the book, when the author is talking about the week that his son learned that the killers of Michael Brown would go free. And he said, "You stayed up till 11 p.m. that night, waiting for the announcement of an indictment. And when instead it was announced that there was none, you said, 'I've got to go.' And you went into your bedroom, and I heard you crying. I came in 5 minutes after, and I did not hug you. I did not comfort you, because I thought it would be wrong to comfort you. I did not tell you that it would be okay, because I have never believed that it would be okay." I thought that was powerful. It's like, wow, it's almost like a cliffhanger. It's like I can imagine just being a child. You want it to be okay. You want to make it okay for your children, but that's something that we're not able to do.
Yeah, agreed. So I no longer sugarcoat that with my children. I don't have boys, I have 2 girls. And so I'm really honest by really talking about my own personal testimonies of oppression. And so I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I want them to see the brutal truth so that they can be prepared. And how do we prepare our children? I know that's not the point of this dialogue, but we have to do more around racial pride, instilling racial pride in our children so that they can prepare themselves. So let me go to the Q&A, and then I'm going to get Dr. Hodges in here. So Joyce or Denise, is there a question in the Q&A?
There's a question from Peg Lehman, and she says, "How do you keep from being paralyzed by despair in the face of repeated acts of brutality and racism visited on African Americans in our country?"
Well, that's the $64 million question, and the one.
Yeah, hence the pause.
Yeah.
Hence the pause, right?
Yeah.
Right. And I
And
just
so-
had this conversation, and I have it frequently about, and self-care becomes a real thing, and it doesn't mean massages and, nice glass of wine and all of that. For me, and I know Peg Lehman, thank you for the question, Peg, but for me, self-care, I have to retreat to Black people.
Mm-hmm.
I have to be in Black spaces where, without even having to say anything, we all share the same trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so I retreat into Black spaces and with Black people, and surround myself with, because in spite of centuries upon centuries upon centuries of atrocities visited upon Black people, we have joy. And it's hard to explain to other people, but we come together and we don't just sit and cry about the atrocities, but we have joy, and we do cry about the atrocities, and we experience joy. So for me, it is about that deep self-care. And self-care for me, while it can be a massage, or, I just spent 9 days in Puerto Rico on a solo vacation, reflecting and sitting on the beach, and that was healing and all of that. But it's really about me immersing myself in Black spaces and with Black people, so that I can come out from the glaze of having to regulate my words with people who I know understand.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you said that, Tracy, because Keisha Williams, who's on the call, she is a leader of our African American affinity group. So when we talk about spaces, that is that Black caucus, the time for Black folks to get together and not necessarily talk about the problems, but really to coalesce about how do we take care of ourselves. So I'm sure Keisha Williams at some particular point might want to jump in and echo some of the sentiments. I'm going to go to Dr. Hodges, and then I want to get Dr. Griffin. He'll briefly respond. And Dr. Haney, if you're on a call, love to hear from you as well. So Dr. Hodges.
Thank you, Teresa. Dr. Randall Hodges, retired administrator from U46, associate minister at Second Baptist Church in Elgin, and currently a adjunct professor at Elgin Community College, and I teach multicultural education. When I start off my multicultural education class, the introductory portion, I always ask my students to look at me and tell me what you see. And the first thing they will say is dysfunctional family, blue collar, hard worker. That's the perception they have of their professor. But then after I allow them to share about me, I tell them that I am a third generation college student, okay? Great grandparents, grandparents, mother and father. So it was an expectation that I go to college. And when I read this book, it gave me chills because of the fact, as a father, as a grandfather, the conversation that you have about protecting your body, okay? And what Coates talks about when he talks about the fact that we are not in control of our body, okay? That our body is always under attack. But being a third generation college student, I believed, I was taught to believe that you go to school, you get an education, and then you don't have to worry about the racism or the world beating you up. That's not true, okay? I happened to work with Tracy Ellis's dad, okay? I was his assistant principal. Tracy Ellis' dad was the first African-American administrator in U46. And we would sit down after school. School would start at 9. We were there at 7 because we had to be there earlier. And we would sit down after school was out and wouldn't get home till 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And my wife would wonder, what in the heck are you guys doing up there that long? And we were sitting down talking, trying to navigate our way through the system because of the fact, even though we were qualified, even though we had education, we still had to combat the racism in society, okay? And so I don't think we will ever have victory. When I was in my 20s, okay, and I graduated undergraduate from the University of Michigan and had the opportunity to attend the Mecca that Coates talked about briefly in his book, which is Howard University, okay? But I do not think that there will ever be victory, because even at my age, being a grandfather, I can still be profiled. I have been in situations where I'm talking to former students, and you got some security people that are looking on the video camera, and they see me and a couple of my students talking in the parking lot, and they say, we need to see what they're up to. And then the security people say, oh, that's Dr. Hodges. So why am I being profiled at this stage in my life? So I don't think that there will ever be victory.
Dr. Hodges, thank you for being so brutally honest with all of us. I'm reading this book, Fugitive Pedagogy. And did you, good, this is just an awesome read. But early on, and even today, white folks did not believe that we could even run our own institutions. So Howard University, president, first president, white man, white man. So much work to be done. So much work to be done. We've got a question in the chat, or we have another question in the chat. Excuse me, the Q&A. I want to get Dr. Griffin really quickly and Dr. Haney right behind Dr. Griffin. Then I'm gonna go to Hall Pike Q&A.
Thank you. Really hard to follow up with what Dr. Hodges just said, because Dr. Hodges was pretty much speaking to.
Oh, Dr. Griffin, you're frozen.
Something that I was going to add, so hard to. Hold on, let me stop my video. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. One of the things that I have accepted, again, what Dr. Hodges was saying is that, you know, there may not be a victory. And one of the things that I tell people most recently in my own network, DST Public Schools, is I'm not in the business of convincing anyone. I'm not here to convince you. I'm here to tell you what it is, and it's up to you to do with that information and understand that in that non-convincing, I'm going to continue to push. And then the second part of that is that I have come to the realization that I don't, you know, my wife and Dr. You know my wife, even from Texas, there are experiences she's had as a Black woman that I don't have, just because she's a Black woman. And one of the things I told her is stop asking why. Don't ask why they do this. Don't ask why this is happening. Don't ask why. I don't ask why. I say this is what it is, and I'm gonna be proactive, and I'm gonna step out, and I'm gonna push back against everything that I know is normalized and that is coming in this country. So I don't convince, and I don't ask why. I see what it is, and I go after it. And a lot of times, to Dr. Hodges' point, there is no victory. I'm honestly not trying to win. I just want to cause problems. I want to be an agitator, like Dr. Godi Muhammad says in her book, Cultivating Genius. I'm not here to win. I'm not here to convince. I'm going to every system I can mess with, and you do with it what you want. And then and that's just what it is.
So I'm not sure what happened. So Dr. Griffin, I don't know if you put yourself on mute, but while you figure that out, let me go to Dr. Haney. Really briefly, Dr. Haney, you're on.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
Thank you all for having this absolutely important conversation. It's so necessary and needed, and I did read this book, as well as many people from our team at Stevenson, where I serve as the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And one of the challenges for us is that we work in a space where our student body is very diverse, but our teaching staff is not, right? And most of those adults were literally taught to be colorblind. Like, they were taught that it is impolite to talk about race. So even entering the conversations are still very, very challenging because of those beliefs. And there's also, you know, this firm belief in meritocracy, and this colorblind added with the principles behind meritocracy. You know, many of our well-intentioned educators really taught in that manner, and their relationships with their students of color were very, very standard and did not come with an understanding of how their experience changes how they see their space, how they access the dominant culture. And that's why I think his book is so important. I appreciate that he's explicit about the visceral experience that racism has for people of color. I use myself as an example as a Black man. I'll never forget, I was an elementary principal, and I was pulled over by the police for driving to work. And while I was pulled over, I was shaking like a twig. I'll never forget. And the officer asked me, he said, "Sir, why are you shaking like that?"
Oh, boy.
And I said, I'll never forget like being so surprised by the question. And I think my answer was, my answer wasn't important. I think I said, "Sir, I haven't been pulled over in a very long time." But the reality was I was shaking because I was a Black man being pulled over by a white police officer, and for no reason. And the officer asked me where was I going? And I said, "I'm going to my school." And he said, "Oh, are you a student?" I said, "No, sir, I'm the principal of Lovett Elementary." And so I share all that to say that, with our people who are having to conduct cross-cultural conversations and without an understanding of every experience, I think it's just critical that we continue these conversations and that we read books like this so that we can better serve our students of color.
Dr. Haney, thank you. You were shaking because you wanted to survive. You were afraid you weren't going to make it.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, Dr. Hallpike.
Well, I've been furiously making notes throughout the conversation here. I'm Clark Hallpike. I teach business at Elgin Community College. I've been there for 44 years and don't plan to retire because there's still some students out there that I need to reach. And so I'll be doing it for quite a long time, as long as my health holds out. Look at Toya. Yeah. So one of the things that I do at ECC is I'm co-chair with Susan Tim of the Magic Committee, and we are doing a series now of Black Lives Matter, and the next edition will be on the anniversary of George Floyd's death, which is May 25th. It will be series number 7. Anyway, there's a lot of work to be done. I used to give Joyce a hard time when she was on campus, when she says, "Clark, I am so tired of this stuff." It gets to me on a daily basis. I don't know if she remembers what I said.
I did.
What did I say?
Do you think Martin got tired?
Exactly. There was no getting tired. And he ultimately gave his life for the work. And did Stokely Carmichael get tired? Did Malcolm X get tired? And so, we just have to do the work and find areas to buttress our ability to carry on. One of the things that I do is, and there's an annual conference called ENCORE. I don't know if anyone has been to that besides Joyce, but it's National Conference on Race and Ethnicity in Higher Education. And what happens there is there are thousands of Black people, and primarily in education. And it's just good once a year to rub elbows and sort of feel rejuvenated in that environment. Some of the things that I have written down besides that is we talk about, when does the situation get solved? If it were up to Black people, guess what? We would have done it a long time ago. But, we don't hold the reins of power in our communities and in the country. Right now, we have 2 Black senators. And so insofar as policy is concerned and all of that, it's very difficult to move beyond the policies, the white policies that are instituted in the country. But my contention is until we have maybe 13 or 14 Black senators and a representation of the Hispanic community and an equal representation in the Senate, I use that as my little barometer of what can happen insofar as the policies in the United States are concerned. So I have lots of examples here that I've written down of situations, and some of you might have heard me talk about the fact that We don't have very many Black professors on our campus, certainly not representative. But I'm sure Toya has heard this example, and maybe Tracy, about when, here's it, that as a professor, we've spent a lot of time in getting educated. And the dean at the time, James McGee, he spent a lot of time with a PhD in mathematics. The reason I mention that all the time is because I'm so jealous, because my math doesn't go far beyond 2 + 2. And anyway, so he, another one of my colleagues were coming out of a meeting. There are 3 Black men coming out of a meeting on campus. And our white colleague says, is this a lineup? Is this, in other words, he's suggesting that the only time you see Black people is when we're in some lineup. And so much of America is conditioned by the 10 o'clock news to determine who we are, because that's great for the media to put us on the 10 o'clock news and see us getting arrested or some gang stuff. That gets viewers, I suppose. And so that's their perception of us. Anyway, so there are other things that I'd like to point out. A few weeks ago, we had a discussion on the model minority, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, what that means to Black people, since we are not considered the model minority. Okay, next.
Joyce giving you the timeout. So we're right at the top of the hour. The conversation so far has been incredibly rich. So I don't know, Joyce or Denise, if you want to go to video and then have someone else sort of moderate this last hour together. It's been so rich, so it's hard to just stop.
I'm thinking that, again, the most of the films are about Coates, and you can access them at your leisure. I think the conversation is so rich that we need to continue this conversation. I want to make one more quick comment. And isn't it interesting that those who hold the seat of power in this country continue to treat Blacks and people of color as if we are the problem? The truth is that the problems of racism and its consequences was started at the beginning of this society and culture, and that has not changed. If those of us on this side had the authority to set the structures and then make sure that they were maintained, we would have different outputs. And so it's like one of the scenarios I always have, if you have 2 brothers and they are at odds, do you really think the 3-year-old is going to be able to overpower the 10-year-old? It's not an equitable fight, because the 10-year-old knows the limitations of the 3-year-old, has had some type of relationship that probably even the 3-year-old has acknowledged that the 10-year-old is in power. And so the idea of continuing to hear cries out of white communities about wanting civility and equity and all of those kinds of things, I contend that if we wanted it, we could create it. But obviously, there is a benefit to whites, and we see that historically, after the Second World War, when veterans were supposed to get homes, who got homes? Who got jobs? Who created the limited communities? Whites only. And so folks in power refuse to acknowledge and act on the reality that they are responsible for the change.
Joyce, that's a really powerful, you're right. This is a really powerful statement. And I think we see that. Someone mentioned earlier, and I don't know if it was Dr. Griffin, I've forgotten who it was now, that said every time Black folks advance, there's a backlash, right? And you can go down through history and you can see that. And we just saw it in the state of Georgia, right?
Absolutely.
There's a backlash. There's a backlash to Black folks securing those 2 Senate seats, right? So now, what are they doing? What's the backlash? They now are trying to take away our voting rights. And it is so blatant and so egregious that they've now criminalized handing. First of all, you remove voting booths. So you create these long, impossible lines that Black folks have to stand in. Now you're going to, in the heat, now you're going to make it illegal to hand them a bottle of water. Now, I've always avoided jail. That is not a place that I think is someplace I want to be. But I tell you what, I'll catch a case in Georgia for that. Like, that is beyond what I can stomach. So like, I'm fully prepared. Like, I'm fully prepared. And I've already told my sons, like, you know, take a picture, get the bond money together, whatever it is you need to do. I'm fully prepared to go to jail for that. So I'm like, this backlash and this idea that every time Black folks try to advance, and, you know, there's an idea that, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. What bootstraps? If we have any, you rip them off. If we have any to begin with, but there's always a backlash to our advancement. And one of the things that I've learned since I've gotten to the seat of power, I sit in the C-suite now. And so one of the things that's been really, Black folks have said, you know, we need to be at the seat of table. We need to be in the room. We need to, you know, and what I've discovered now is, and there are a lot of Black folks in my organization who are at the seat of power. And you know what that means? We get the first bullet. We get hit in the head first, or we just have the opportunity to observe the BS go down. Dr. Lance, you feel me? So, you know, Joyce, you're right. The solution, the reason Black folks, we don't have a solution because we didn't create the problem and we don't maintain the problem.
Bingo.
There's a very
wanted this solved, they could solve it.
There is
Right. So
there's a question in the chat that relates to this.
go ahead, Denise.
It says research experts want to know what can be done about the values of poor segregated children. And this is a question that needs asking, but they do not ask what can be done about the values of people who have segregated these communities. They know this is happening and it is intentional. So it's related to the same thing. How do you change the system?
Yes, so before we get to that, 1 second, Joyce. So
Sure.
Dr. Hodges, I'm trying to do my best moderate. I know everybody's got something they want to say, and I'm trying to get folks in here. Dr. Hodges, your hand is up. So we're going to go to Dr. Hodges, then we're going to go to Joyce. We got close to 40 people attendees. And so if there are attendees who have questions, they want to jump into this conversation, not via the chat, please raise your hand and we're going to get you in here. So Dr. Hodges, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I want to respond to Tracy's comment about her willingness to catch a case, okay? And when she talks about her willingness to catch a case, it draws me back to Coates when he talks about the other world in the book. And he talks about Caucasian parents strolling down the sidewalk with their double wide strollers with their children in. And then a white parent pushes his son. And immediately he responds to protect his son, to protect his body, putting himself at risk because of the fact that it's a possibility that he could be put in jail, because some of the bystanders who happen to be white said, don't you know you can go to jail for that, okay? So as middle-class Black folks, and it's a lot of middle-class Black folks on this line, it behooves us to educate our children, to let them know that they cannot fall asleep. They have to be awake, because the fact, just because you middle class does not mean racism cannot happen to you. Short story, grandchildren live in Atlanta. They attend this private school. I think the tuition is about $30,000 or $40,000 a year. You pull up into their parking lot and you see everything other than a hoopty, okay? But then when they go out with their friends, I have a Black grandson that's 21 years old. I'm afraid to death when he goes out, because of the fact that just because he happens to be from a middle class family does not mean that he's not going to experience racism. And he has. When he was asked to lay flat down on the ground because he's riding with his other white friends on an all-purpose vehicle in a white neighborhood, and the police pull their guns on him to want to know, why are you in that neighborhood? So I say that to say that we have to be cautious in terms of being willing to take that case, because we all are willing to take that case for our children, for our grandchildren, but we don't want to make an error like Coates talks about. And when we make an error, then we catch a case and then we put our families in jeopardy.
That's
Dr.
it.
Hodges, thank you.
I wanted to
Go ahead, Dr. Webb.
add something, if I may, as we queue up the next video. It begins with this statement, and I want to throw it out there as a question before we watch the next video. So he says, white supremacy and the present and the preservation of white supremacy is a fundamental fact in the United States that has been systematically upheld. And this speaks to the comments that Clark and Joyce made about, Clark mentioned that we need more senators, we need more representation. And he said, because we don't hold the reins of power. And Joyce said that they are responsible for it, right? Because they created this issue. And so then I want to ask a question: how do we reach those people? How do we reach those who are in power? What more can we do?
One quick thing, Toya, before you get your responses to that. I believe we decided we were going to forego the other film because the conversation is so rich. And as we've talked about, many of us rarely get these opportunities. And I just want to say one more thing related to my last comments. And I've been saying this for years. We hear lots of folks, not just people of color. There are white allies. There are folks who get it. But my bottom line is, for those folks in power, which in this society are white, if racism is a problem, it's white folks' problem. You made it, you sustain it, you modify it, and you never let it go. So I hope lots of folks will stop and take that into consideration. Racism is a white folks' problem. So I think when there are problems, you go to those who have the authority and ability to solve those problems. Teresa, were you inviting someone else to comment?
Well, I certainly want to get folks who want to engage further in this conversation. I know people are responding, making comments in the chat and the Q&A, but if they want to unmute and join us in this conversation, we can certainly promote them to panelists. And while we figure out who that is, I think about white allyship because we have 5 affinity groups in District U46. And so I want to give a shout out to Dr. Griffin, who really, he's in Colorado, but he really helped me try to facilitate that and get that launched. But what I'll say is, of those 5 affinity groups, our white allyship is our largest affinity group. So we do have white folks out there who want to engage, but here is what I'll say. we really need to move from the ally part, and we really need white people to make some sacrifices, some very personal and professional sacrifices. So what do I mean by that? I'll give you an example, and you may have heard it. When we think about Bree Newsom, who she climbed that pole, and you might have heard this story, but she climbed the pole, and she was going to take down the flag and protest what was transpiring across the country in terms of brutality. The police, they told her to come down from the pole. And she refused. But there was a white guy who was there, and they were going to tase that pole to get her down. What do you think that white man did? He wrapped himself around that pole. He touched that pole because he knew the police were not going to endanger his body. So we need more white people to be like that white man. We need more white folks to make personal and professional sacrifices. Great, you're reading books. Great, you're a part of these calls, webinars, podcasts. But are you in the room advocating that policies and practices are changing? Are you advocating that we need more superintendents, board members, principals, teachers who look like, or rather who are Black and brown? How are you really working to eradicate the inequities and the racism that occurs within your own sphere of control? And so I'll pause there. I'd love to get some folks, our attendees in this conversation, if you can, please. Tracy said, get your hands dirty with us.
Well, there's
That's right.
there's a question here. It says,
Okay, well, April's gonna come in. We'll get,
okay.
let's
It's
go to
direct-
Dr.
it's directed
Wells.
to you.
Okay, well, let's go to April and then we'll go to that comment or question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Lance, and good afternoon, everyone on the panel. So I wanted to share that in response to the question, what do we do in terms of really reaching those in power? And I don't know if my answer is the most adept one, but for my focus and my work, I have shifted. And part of my responsibility and obligation that I see is helping to provide access and open doors and build up the capacity of the people who look like me and have been marginalized, and their voices and experiences have not been embraced and welcomed in some of these spaces. So I think as equal as it is to figure out how to reach those who are in power and developing co-conspirators and the nature of that work, it's also imperative that I am providing access to little girls and boys who look like me, because they're going to be the ones to continue the fight. It's imperative that I, wrap arms and link arms with the parents who look like me and have stories and experiences that are similar to that, because I believe that part of this work, and an inextricable part of this work, is continuing to build a critical mass that we have within us as a community. And I believe that when we develop that, when we tap that, and I like to call myself like, Tracy Ellis, little junior sister. So I see the necessity of that. I understand that. And I am operating from this disposition that we're tired of asking for permission. We are tired of asking for permission, tired of asking for seats at table. But what we can do is to provide access and the embrace and build the capacity in the community we do have. And let's build our own from there. Thank you.
I think that's an excellent response. And when I think about some of these meetings and conversations that we have, even with the Black Lives Matter series that Clark has mentioned, sometimes you see the same faces all the time. Mm-hmm. And so then I wonder, obviously having these conversations, I've tried them myself. They're hard to have, right? Because people interpret them as we're pointing the finger or it's too hard for them to hear. And so I'm just wondering, we really do want to expand these conversations to reach more than the same people, right? And so how do we get them to care about this? How do we, is it them educating themselves on the issue? Or does it take something more than that? Does it really take, as someone mentioned, we need more accomplices? So is it not the allies, right? From allies to accomplice. Do we need those who are accomplices to go out and reach these people who are not joining and participating in these conversations?
I would love to add to that last question right there. And I know what I'm about to say might be a little unpopular, but I gotta call it what it is. Sometimes we have to check, and I'm gonna say that like without abandon, we have to check our youth. Because what I found out in some of my work and then within my own organization, when we had people who wanted to be allies and people who wanted to be accomplices, sometimes our youth and their youthful wisdom didn't want to let them in. Like, you don't have a right to be a part of this. You don't get to talk. You don't get to talk about race. You don't get to present. And that's problematic for me, because when people are trying to engage and they're reaching out and they're asking, what do I do? Because people, give them some grace. They may not know what to do. We have to educate and walk alongside with them while they're walking alongside with us. And sometimes we have to, what is it called? Switch, motivate the elephant, direct the rider. Sometimes we have to direct the rider once the elephant is ready to go and clear the path and clear the obstacles. And sometimes I've had to come face to face with some of our youthful members and say, hey, you're wrong for that. You don't get to tell that person that they can't talk about this when they're trying. And then later we're upset because we're tired and we're saying no one's helping. Well, we have people standing at the door, open the door and help, educate. So that's one of my responses, is that we sometimes got to educate our youth and point them in the right direction and help them not be the obstacles to some of our accomplices as well. And a prime example that I'm gonna stop here are white men. Like, I've had situations where white men are trying to do the work and white women and LGBTQIA people and Black people and Hispanic people are shutting them down. We can't do that. So I've had to be an ally and an accomplice to break down that barrier, to put them on the stage next to me. So we got to make sure that, I know we're talking about how do we bring them in. Sometimes we are our own worst enemies at times, not all the time, 10% of the time. We got to sometimes tell people that, hey, let folks in and let's get it done. We can't do the Malcolm X way of, I don't need your help. It's not true. We need that help sometimes.
Teresa?
Thank you. Go ahead, Denise.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Griffin.
What I want to do is combine 3 or 4 statements because it all relates to what we're talking about. Somebody says, we need to move from ally to accomplice. Yes, we need white co-conspirators. We have to get you have to get your hands dirty with us. And then somebody says, Dr. Lance, we can sacrifice, speak out in our organizations, push for policy change and raise voices and educate ourselves and our families and our colleagues. And then somebody else says, yes, we need more white people to listen to these conversations. So I think there's a lot of agreement about kind of what's needed.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in from our panelists? Dr. Webb, did you want to add anything further, or Dr. Hodges, Dr. Hall-Pike, anyone?
Yeah, I like to comment, Teresa. Someone on the chat talked about discernment, having to have discernment in terms of we partnering with white people in terms of them being accomplices or co-conspirators. We do have to have discernment, but the treatment or what we've gone through all these years has given me, I can't talk about other Black men, it has given me a sense of paranoia, okay? A permanent sense of paranoia, because if I don't have that permanent sense of paranoia, then I cannot protect my body. And so when Coates talked about our bodies always being subjected to the world, okay, and that the police department receiving an endowment to destroy our bodies, okay, I can't just let anybody into my world. So I've got a permanent sense of paranoia.
Wow. Hence this idea about fatigue, racial battle fatigue. If we constantly have to live and go about our daily lives in paranoia and anxiety, like Dr. Haney talking about shaking when he was pulled over. That's not that we can't live like that. It's not sustainable. Thank you, Dr. Hodges. Dr. Webb, did you want to jump in?
I just wanted to acknowledge a couple of comments there. Danielle, thank you so much for your solutions to how you can get involved, and just for all of us in general. And then Mary makes a comment here. She says, I am a white ally, I hope. And right now, I just feel deeply sad as I listen to each of you speak about the horrors you have faced and about your fears for your children. All I can offer is my support. I would love to call myself an accomplice. And I would say your support is definitely needed and appreciated. And I just wanted to acknowledge your comment.
I'd also like to say, because I know Mary Sheshgreen, and I would say that Mary is as much an accomplice as anybody I know, as any white person that I know. So Mary.
I'll second that, Tracy. She's in the battle.
Mary Sheshgreen is in the battle. She's getting her hands dirty.
Well, that's awesome. So sounds like we need more Marys. That's good. That's good. Let me bring this book, Between the World and Me. Let me bring it into education, because I believe that if we can make some changes in our educational system, I mean, that's the huge lever right there. So here's this question. Coates says in the book, the schools were not concerned with curiosity, but rather with compliance. What does this statement depict of the American educational institution at the time? And can these lines of the novel be predicted as a plea for reform of the educational system? And I'm going to read that quote one more time. The schools were not concerned with curiosity, but rather with compliance. What does that statement depict of our American educational institution? Anyone?
And there's a question that goes along with it that's in the Q&A that says, what changes or lack do you see in the racial attitudes and awareness of the new students that are coming into schools in 2021?
Well, we're going to hold that question.
Okay.
Because let's hold off on that one. Let's stick with this question right here, Denise.
Tracy, let me respond to that. Before I retired, I was faculty in the sociology department, and the department would get together periodically to look at new texts. And I'm sure many of you heard about this, where McGraw-Hill, and interesting, here's the whole story. So a teenage young Black man brings home his new history textbook and shows it to his mom and says, Mom, look at this. And this book is saying, they were talking about immigration and what each group and how and why they immigrated to this country. And under Blacks, they said that Blacks migrated to America to get jobs. Now, if we know anything, we know that's crazy. So during the time and that was a McGraw-Hill book, one of the largest education producers there is. The mother took the book, went back to the school, and it went up the chain to McGraw-Hill, and they resisted initially. And said, well, you know, we spent a lot of money, and we'll revise the electronic book, but we won't do the hard copy because it costs too much money. We'll do it next cycle. And they fought that position until ultimately the resistance became too hard. So they did replace the text. But as I look at the education environment, what else is going right there? What else is going on? And as we look at educating our students, as we look at looking for allies, I think one of the other things we all have to do is trust but verify. because having an organization like that take a conscious decision to tell lies. Black people were brought to this country in chains against their will to be workers. So now to change the narrative, that's another thing we have to look out for. What I told that representative is, I don't hold you personally responsible for that. I know that was beyond you, but I cannot in good conscience endure a book that's going to lie and continue to cause more harm, not just for students of color, but for all students.
Joyce,
Thank you, Joyce. So 1 second, because I got Dr. Hall Pike's hand is up. He's so patient. He uses that hand thing. So I want to get to Dr. Hall Pike, and I'm going to ask you all again to try to stick to that question, because Carter G. Woodson said, he said, there will be no lynching if it didn't start in the classroom. There will be no lynching if it didn't start in the classroom. So come on, y'all, let's bring it to the schoolhouse. All right, Dr. Hall Pike, what do you have?
Okay, that sounds like a serious challenge here. Anyway, I have 3 questions to contemplate that we should all contemplate. Question number 1, is there systemic racism in the United States? I think we all know the answer to that. Is there systemic racism in your institution, at ECC, in U46? And because we've got to admit that if there's systemic racism in the United States, we're not immune. Why would ECC be immune? Why would U46 be immune? And then the third question is, how do we systemically eradicate racism in our institutions? The first step, I haven't been, but if you've been to Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step is you've got to admit it and apologize and remediate. So, you know, we have to face the fact that if there's racism in the United States, there is inevitably racism at our institution, and we have to be willing to call it out, right? Because we're not immune. End of story.
Thank you, Dr. Hall Pike. Tracy?
Yeah, so, I used to be really dumb and ignorant about this issue in the schoolhouse, Dr. Lance. And then Joyce Fountain took advantage of that naivete and tricked me into running for school board.
Just trying to keep you in the Army.
And then I messed around and won twice. And so I could not be ignorant anymore. And I have wrestled, even with my own experience. I can't say I was really ignorant because I had 2 kids that went through school, right? And so they went through school in U46, and then we moved to Atlanta, and they went to school in Georgia. So not totally ignorant, but really getting to see behind the scenes. And it became really, really real to me when I understood on a whole new level Malcolm X's quote that only a fool would let his enemy teach his children. Now, I'm saying that when you've got a system that wasn't built, it wasn't built by us, and it wasn't even built for us, right? I've wondered, like, oh, why did I send my kids? Why did I leave them? Like, I looked at the system and was like, always having to advocate, always having to go up there, always having to fight and navigate that system. And I'm like, why? Why would I leave my kids in? Why did I leave my kids in that system? And I understand now this movement. My sister homeschools her kids, and I'll tell you what, if I had to do it all over again, my children would never cross the threshold of a school in this country. I would educate my kids because I want them to know the truth of of who they are in America. I want them to know the truth of who they were before they came to America. I want them to know that they will not see American history books. So that real, sending my own kids through the system, then getting on the school board and understanding in a behind the scenes how the sausage is made kind of way, really, really brought home that quote for me. And so I think, if one thing Black folks could do, and I understand it's a bigger issue and all of that, but if I could snap my finger, on the trajectory towards getting rid of racism, I'd snap my finger and just yank out all Black children out of American schools. And we would educate them ourselves.
Hear you. I hear you. Dr. Griffin, Dr. Hodges. Dr. Griffin, you're next, and then Dr. Hodges.
I'm gonna try to make this as brief as possible because I love that question, because that's literally where I start in my work in DSST and when I do my consultancy. So when Coates talks about how it's not curiosity, it's compliance, that goes all the way back to the Jeffersonian model, because curiosity was never meant for common people. Curiosity was meant for elite, noble, wealthy white men with property. And that's the conceptual whiteness that Dr. Lance Billings talks about in her article, What is Critical Race Theory During in a Nice Place Like Education? So that curiosity was never meant for everyone else. And if you go throughout history at every typographical moment and every time there were laws passed, anti-slavery literacy laws, because that's biblical. An educated man is not fit to be a slave. That's biblical. So they put that in South Carolina and multiple laws to keep the enslaved from being curious. Then we continue going, women can't learn, indigenous people can't learn. Then we have the National Defense of Education Act of 1958 with Sputnik, where they put STEM education. And if any of you remember Adam Clayton Powell, he had an amendment in there that said any Southern school or system that was still under segregation could not get funding, because he knew that that would be another form of segregation to promote white children into STEM. That's why here we are in 2021, and that is the majority of scientists, because curiosity was never meant for everyone else. 1983 Nation at Risk was not about curiosity, it was about compliance. 2001 was when we first started seeing this rigor question with No Child Left Behind, but it was not about curiosity. So here we are in 2021, and now we're starting to grasp, well, what is the problem with critical race theory? It's curiosity. The country says they want curiosity and critical thinking until the common people start to be curious and critically question what is happening in the United States. So the ban on critical race theory isn't about tenet number one, the racism. That's the one they're dying on. It's about the other 5 or 6, like neoliberalism is the reason why racism is sustained, because they want to stay in the middle, according to these work. Anti-racism, they want to play the middle. They don't want to be fully anti-racist, but then they don't want to be racist. We want to keep the status quo. So that's why curiosity is an issue for folks, because we start to question and we critically question everything that happens. And then lastly, I mean, on this, that's an ironic question, because 2 weeks ago, I did a session with our programming team. This is our academics team, humanities, all of these folks. And I put a slide up, and Dr. Lance, you may remember this because we unpacked this in District 2. We said, what counts as an exceptional or an effective advanced placement or gifted child? Guess what the number one question, the answer was? Curiosity. So then I said, then why is it that when Black and brown children show curiosity in the non-AP and the non-gifted and honors classes, they are suspended and sent to the office and expelled? Because curiosity is only meant for certain groups of people. But when everybody expresses curiosity, now we see Black girls being suspended 6 times more than white children. We see Black boys being suspended 3 times more, because they're questioning their environment. And Dr. Lance, I know you remember us having that conversation and pushing back against our AP teachers on that very thing.
I do. I recall all too well. So anything gifted and talented, April Wells, who's still here on the panel, she could speak to it. I know she calls herself Mini Tracy Ellis, but the reality is we've got an expert right here who can speak to some of the atrocities that have occurred when we talk about identifying our children. Dr. Hodges, would you like to weigh in, sir?
Yes, I'm glad that Dr. Griffin mentioned that curiosity piece, because this fits right along with what I was going to say about the role of education in eradicating racism. And I think we have to have boldness in terms of our educators, our teachers, and not just our Black educators, okay, but our white educators, our allies, our accomplices, they have to be bold. And when I talk about boldness, I'm talking about being willing to teach the truth. Now, when you talk about the curriculum, someone mentioned the fact with why would you want your nemesis to teach your children, okay? And then someone mentioned in the chat the fact that Brown versus Board of Education decision was a harm to children because of the fact that it put Black children in venues with educators that may not have had their best interests at heart, okay? My wife and I moved here from Michigan, an urban area. And in this urban area, you got Black principals throughout the system. You have Black counselors throughout the system. I was blessed to be a counselor and blessed to be a counselor for my children, which meant that I could look at their programs to make sure that they were on course, to make sure that they had the right support, okay? But then you move to the suburbs in Illinois, where there's not as many Black administrators, there's not as many Black teachers, so Black students might not get the support that they need. They might get it from a few African-American teachers, okay? But they might not get it from some of the white teachers who happen not to be allies, who happen not to be accomplices. So there's a disconnect there, okay? And so what needs to happen is that our students need to be motivated to be thirsty for the truth. And remember what Coates talked about, when Coates talked about where did he go to quench his thirst at Howard University? He went to the library. He went to the library that there was no restriction on the types of reading material that he could get. And he delved into that reading material. And from that reading material, he gained the truth. And imagine how powerful our educational system could be if our students strived for the truth on their own, as well as getting the truth in the classroom. I think that would help do it.
Dr. Hodges, thank you. Is there anything in the chat or the Q&A that we need to unearth? And then I want to go to Ms. Ellis. I'm gonna just pose a question.
I think almost everything that's here, that's in the chat or the Q&A has been talked about, except the question about 2021 and where students are that are coming into the system now.
Will you read the question for us, please?
Oh, gosh. Okay, let me see if I can find it again.
Let's see
It
if
says,
we can.
what changes or lack of do you see in the racial attitudes and awareness of the realities of race in America among students in 2021 compared to earlier decades, Black, white,
Thank
and
you,
other?
Tracy. Thank you, Tracy.
So I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that, but I think we put a lot of onus on the children when we should be looking at the adults. There's so much that we can say in that, and it's interesting because where I was going to go, Ms. Ellison, in your book that I read, The Exceptional Negro, Racism, White Privilege, and the Lie of Respectability Politics. And I think about on page 83, so I'm tying in multiple authors here, but you talk about culturally incompetent teachers. If we could just spend a couple of minutes, if you don't mind, culturally incompetent teachers, and couple that with culturally incompetent leaders. So whether it's school leaders or district leaders. because it's not, yeah, our children have to do some work. We realize that, but who's teaching our children? So let's start with the adults. Let's start with ourselves. Tracy, you want to respond?
Yeah, and I was like, wait, where's my book? What did I say on page 83? But I was
I'm sorry, I put you on the spot. I'm like, you're the author, you know what page.
I just wrote the book. I don't no, but I mean, this idea of having culturally competent teachers in the classroom. So someone earlier on this panel spoke about, or maybe it was Dr. Griffin, someone talked about, white people being raised and socialized to be colorblind. I just did a webinar, a workshop on this on Friday, but being raised to be colorblind and the virtue
that was
of
Dr. Haney. Dr. Haney,
yes, this idea of color blindness. But I did a whole TEDx talk on color blindness and the belief, my fervent belief that color blindness obscures racism and therefore perpetuates racism. It's not a virtue, it's not a help. And so then you take teachers, put them in the classroom who are, probably colorblind and working to be colorblind, and some with good intent, some not so well intended, but who don't recognize that we have a culture. We have a culture, and it is different than the Eurocentric lens on everything. And so how our children are seen in classrooms as being behavior disordered, not being as intelligent, not being seen as gifted, all of those ways that this lack of knowledge about our children manifest. And I don't want to just blame teachers, because hey, we are all socialized in this country, and Black folks have to unpack a lot of our own internalized racism from being socialized in this country and learning, getting these negative images and negatively reinforced stereotypes about us. And so white people have that stuff about us. And if you aren't doing the work to unpack that and dismantle that, you show up believing that kids are what you've heard they are, that our children are what you've heard they are. Okay, instead of understanding that Black folks as a whole, we may tend to be louder, more boisterous. We may tend to be, that could be a cultural thing. That's not to say that Black kids don't misbehave, but when you come into the classroom with the idea that every manifestation out of a little Black boy that is not compliant with your directive is something wrong with that child. And then we see the stats on how our kids are disciplined more harsher. It mimics the criminal justice system. We're charged in the criminal justice system. We're charged with harsher crimes for the same behavior. In school, they're charged. Their behavior is seen more harshly than similar behavior from white kids. Okay, they are then disciplined more harshly, just like we're sentenced more harshly in the criminal justice system, right? And that's that school to prison pipeline. And even I see it, listen, I work at the Land of Milk and Honey for the state of Illinois, the Illinois Mathematics and Science Academy. Knowledge doesn't get, at the high school level, knowledge doesn't get much more vaunted than at that place. And let me tell you, the ideas that you see in the regular K-12, we're not part of the K-12 we're so vaunted, we're not even part of the K-12 ecosystem in the state of Illinois, all right? We are a state agency. We get to do what we want. We're not subjected to the Illinois school code. We can do almost anything we want. And yet we replicate the same things that are in the regular K-12 system. And we've got gifted students there. It's just that who in the building doesn't believe those Black and brown children there are gifted, because it doesn't fit this Eurocentric box of what giftedness looks like, and how our children manifest giftedness might be different than that Eurocentric definition. And therefore they're shut out. Therefore it is believed that they don't belong there. It is believed that we somehow, as a Black cabinet with a Black Puerto Rican president and a Black cabinet running the place, that we have dumbed down standards to increase Black and brown student admission from 11% to 17%. over the last 6 years because they don't really belong there. Those folks wanted the gifted students, right? So these are all the ways that this issue manifests in the education system and how our kids are constantly being under this scrutiny. They're constantly being criminalized. They're constantly being disciplined. They are constantly under surveillance. When I sat on the board of District U46, quarterly we get an expulsion report, all right? In closed session, right? And so I'm not telling any closed session secrets. The expulsion report came every quarter, and it had all the names and was broken out demographically by race and gender of who was being expelled in the district, all right? And every single quarter, for almost 2 full terms that I sat on that board, every single quarter, Black students were the primary ones getting expelled. Black and Latino students. And I always would say, either U46 has the best behaved white kids in the world, or something is happening here, because there are more white kids. There's a high percentage of Black and brown and low at risk, but there are only the at-risk students, but there are more white children here, okay? There are only 7% Black kids. How can we be 30% or whatever the number was of expulsions? There has to be something going on. So you're saying that white kids just don't do expellable offenses? And I'm not saying that Black kids don't do expellable offenses. I'm saying so do white kids. Why aren't they on this report? Where are they? Because they're not being expelled. So all of this stuff, is happening in our education systems, and it's that lack of cultural competence in the classroom and at the administrative level that doesn't even know to challenge this, because it is the norm. It is the way things are. There's nothing broken. And that's true. The system's operating like it was built to operate, and no one can see to challenge it. And if you dare try to mess with the discipline policies, then what you have is the teachers will accuse you of not supporting them in the classroom, right? And so the need to be, first of all, before you can get to cultural competence, you need to have some cultural humility. First of all, you need to recognize that you don't know what you need to know and be in a position to be coachable and willing to learn. And on that trajectory to getting to cultural competence, understanding that journey is about unpacking everything you thought you knew about how this country operates. And that's where it gets hard, where people resist being culturally competent, because it is an indictment, a personal indictment. Right? You've got to unpack all that you thought you knew, and you've got to rearrange that stuff and be open to hearing the stories of marginalized and historically oppressed people and believing us, and then changing behavior and changing policies and changing practices and changing resource allocation, because your budgets are moral documents. Where you spend your money, open up your checkbook. Let me see how you spend your money. I'm gonna tell you what you value. All right, I'll stop there.
No, Tracy, I felt the passion through the screen. I felt it. I heard it. I see it on paper, and then I heard it from you. So I appreciate that. And what I just wrote as you were talking, it's about checking ourselves. Check ourselves. Check ourselves. Dr. Griffin, I see you, but Denise, there was a comment in the chat that you wanted to bring out. Somebody help her out for me, please.
I muted myself because I was coughing.
Okay.
This says, some allies like Mary and the guy wrapping himself around the pole instinctively understand how to help. Others not so much. So allies need to be educated on how to help. Example, so instead of Tracy taking a case, we need to have our white allies come out in great numbers to help hand out the water and speak out against voter suppression. Systemic racism is not sustainable and is pervasive, but there is a need to educate the public en masse about steps to take, how to maintain accountability, and how to act for good. This has to happen for humanity's sake, for our planet's sake, and for our people. Deep gratitude for the opportunity to listen, hope to share the truth. And that's from Miranda Green. I thought it was a really wonderful statement.
Thank you. Thank you for reading that. Thank you for sharing that. I see April's got her hand up.
Let me just interject one thing?
Go ahead, Joyce, quickly, please.
That Miranda Green is a young lady from out of state and knows some things about our community. And I appreciate her being able to share that with us.
Awesome, thank you. So I want to get April's hand is up, and then I think there was someone else who had another comment, and I might have missed it. Oh, Dr. Griffin. So let me go April, and then Dr. Griffin, and then we're going to try to bring closure to this afternoon.
Yeah, I was just going to share sentiments when we talk about, the move, that education being about compliance. We have seen in education critical thinking as a luxury good. And when we look at the opportunity to open doors into pathways and services, I specifically sit in the seat of overseeing programming in Gifted. And we have made it so that we know literally all children can think. When we talk about some of these practices where they're culturally destructive, we see educators who don't know how to navigate that cultural perception gap. So what they see as manifestations from children of color, Black children, overwhelmingly Black boys, they misinterpret that for something other than what it is, which we understand and see it to speaking to giftedness and high ability. There is also the pervasive thought that when we see abilities and talent and groups that we've normed behaviors to whiteness being the standard, and being open enough to see that, first of all, like in U46 and with the National Association, we know giftedness occurs in all populations. So having an explicit desire to open doors, but it doesn't start with just your identification. How are we supporting these students? How are we inviting parents? How are we inviting the community? And some of the other things that we look at when we talk about opening doors, part of the reason we talk about leaders and teachers, there is a commitment to maintaining the status quo in the way we have the American educational system. So when we ask what differences are we seeing in students, I can tell you what we're seeing in students. We're seeing students who are showing up and have this resistance capital that we kind of are like being blown away by. They're not interested in complying with these little checks and boxes that you have for them. They are there to show up, bringing the fullness and knowing that shrinkage is not something that we're going to continue to do. And we have a responsibility of providing systems and environments that will acknowledge who they are when they show up day one. We talk about being able to develop co-conspirators, whatever we want to call it. Part of it starts with stop just running with the sound bites and looking at the fullness of lived experiences that are shared, because we develop decisions about groups based on outside perspectives when we could go to the bodies of those people we're speaking to and ask them about their experiences and take that to inform our policies, practices, and beliefs and all that we see in education. Thank you.
Awesome. No, thank you, April. I appreciate that. It makes me think about this push for trauma-informed care. So I tweeted out earlier this week that we keep talking about we got to do something for our students because they're coming to us with all this trauma. And I said, well, what about the trauma that we have caused in schools? So our children come to us already resilient, and they're walking away from us being trauma impacted because of what we do as a system. So spot on. Thank you. Who's bringing us home? I forgot where I was going. Oh, all right. See, y'all, I'm supposed to be moderating and I'm running my mouth. Okay.
There's one question, and that is that people asked about the sources of the videos that we didn't play. And it is in the chat, but they are from Democracy Now! Part 1 and Part 2. And the other is a 60 Minutes program on Ta-Nehisi Coates. And so if you look those up, you can see what you didn't see.
Thank you. And let's put them back in the chat for those who might have joined later or they're.
Yeah, they're there. They're still there. You just have to scroll for them.
Well, let's help them out, Denise. Let's put them back. There we go. Somebody just put it in there. All right, Dr. Griffin, 2 minutes, and then we're going to close this out. Dr. Griffin.
I can do it in one, no. Well, actually, April Wells really spoke to what I was going to say, and that's how the children are showing up. They're showing up with this curiosity. They're showing up with anger. they're showing up with answers and solutions. And if we would stop and listen, they can tell us what they need and what they want and how to overcome their trauma or work through or navigate their trauma. So going back to what I said earlier, and I'm sorry everyone if I keep giving Dr. Lance this shout out, but it started when I was one of her principals. And I'm doing the same thing in my current network. And that is, again, I'm not trying to convince you. I'm not even trying to change your mind. But what you are going to do is you're going to develop a space where children show up and they're going to be given the platform to speak their truth inside a classroom. And what that means is sometimes we create safe spaces in the classroom when situations happen around the country, even if it's for 15 minutes, but still to decompress and have a restorative circle with one another about what's happening. Or we're creating that safe space after school where children are able to come together and speak their truth and even provide feedback on how systems are operating. So when we know that children are showing up with this, we can't have willful ignorance. Like, Dr. Ellis said, cultural insensitivity. A lot of that is willful and intentional. They know kids are different than everyone else and everybody's different. They are choosing, we have staff members that are literally choosing to go to their comfort base and center their reality over children and say, well, I'm colorblind and I just don't know what to do. Yes, you do. You go Google everything else you don't know what to do. So I'm just saying, building on what you said, I'm not about convincing. I'm not changing mindsets. I'm not changing ideologies and beliefs. This is the structure we're going to do, and these kids are going to be able to speak. And that's the way we're training our network right now to prepare for August.
Thank you so very much. Look, we got a ton of panelists that started the call right here on the screen. And then we just pulled in Dr. Haney, Dr. Griffin, April Wells. You all didn't know you were going to be panelists, but guess what? You are panelists today. I absolutely want to thank all of you for this 2 hours of your time to engage in what I believe to be a very rich and robust conversation on a Sunday afternoon. Hope you were able to get church in like me, get a workout in like me. After this call, I'm going to eat like me, but it has truly been an honor to sort of moderate this conversation today. I want to thank our hosts, the Gale Borden Public Library, and at that, I'll turn it back over to Denise and Joyce.
Okay, let me just say, I want to thank very much the Coalition of Elgin Religious Leaders, the Interfaith Clergy Leaders for thinking of this and for seeing it through. And I want to thank everybody who helped make this possible. Tish at the library, and Joyce, I'll now throw it to you.
All I have to add is I think it was time well spent. I thank everyone for their attendance and their participation. And like every good thing, don't leave it here. Take it with you, make it live, and make an impact in our educational systems. Our students' very lives depend on it. And that's it for me. Thank you all so much. Thank you for all the guests, and thank you, Tish, for being in the background and adding all that you did to this event. Couldn't have happened as well without you.
And we'll send out the link to the recording as soon as it's available, hopefully sometime this week. We will send it to all panelists, attendees, and everybody who registered, because we know that some people couldn't join us today to hear it live.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.